Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever time it is, when and where you're watching this, whether you're in the UK, US, France, Nepal, the Dragon Kingdom of Bhutan, or the Serene Republic of San Marino. I bid you welcome to Ellroy Reads. This is a show where every week I look at a book that was an influence to James Ellroy. But this week I'm going to shake up the format a little bit because I know a lot of writers watch this show, particularly young writers and writers at the beginning of their career. So I thought it might be interesting if I was to talk about the first book I ever worked on and, give you not so much advice, but tell you a little bit about my journey and, where it went right, where it went wrong. And perhaps that might be of some inspiration to you. So the first book I ever worked on was Conversations with James Ellroy, and this is part of the Literary Conversations series published by University Press of Mississippi. And the Literary Conversations series is a wonderful academic series. They've published over 100 volumes so far of interviews throughout their careers by some of the world's leading literary figures. And it's probably the best interview anthology series out there. And I was a big fan of the series when I was doing my PhD. I still am. And around the time I started having phone conversations with James Ellroy, which were kind of long and engrossing and really rewarding, and of course I was recording them. My supervisor, David Seed at the University of Liverpool, said, you should really think about publishing these. And University Press of Mississippi, they do the best. Their literary conversation series is the best. And I thought, they wouldn't be interested. But here's how it panned out. These sorts of academic series tend to have two editors. One is an academic who's the kind of high priest of the series, oversees it from a kind of aesthetic point of view, and then the editor at the publisher who handles the nuts and bolts. So I reached out to Peggy Whitman Prenshaw, who was the academic, the literary editor, and I think she was semi-retired. She was by then teaching in a small college in Mississippi. I reached out to her and I put together not so much a proposal, a very, very polished email telling her I've had these great conversations with James Ellroy. I've been collecting interviews that he's done throughout his career. Would you be interested in doing conversations with James Ellroy as part of the Literary Conversations series? She reached back to me and said, that sounds really, really interesting. Now I'm sending this information to Walter Biggins, who'll be your editor at UPM. And he took a long time to get back to me, and that's another thing about publishing is that some people, editors and agents, they work on their own time, and I can't explain it. That they can take months to get back to you, easily months, to the point where you think that, oh, that's it, it's done, we're through. And then they get back to you as if you emailed them yesterday. But anyway, Walter Biggins was a very nice chap, and he said he was interested. He says, you have to put together a formal proposal, which I did. I was meticulous about it. I sent it off. And then they handed me the contract, and I was working on my first book. And I never stopped to think, whoa, am I cut out for this? Because rule number one of publishing, you'll never see a green light you don't like. You just have to say yes to everything if you want to get ahead. So how it worked was UPM gave me a budget to purchase the copyrights to reproduce the interviews in the anthology. Their basic rule was, well, the hard and fast rule was, the interviews are published in the order they were conducted to get seamless chronology, not the order they were published in necessarily originally. And they gave me a budget which was $800 to buy copyright. And they say if it went over $800, this was the early teenies, I suppose you'd call them, and $800 was a bit more than it is today. But they said if you go over $800, it comes out of your royalties. And if you go over $1,200, get back in touch with us because you're in trouble. in the end, I went over about, I think, about $860. I was happy to forfeit $60 royalties to get the book done in the way I wanted it to be. Now, because it was an interview anthology, I wasn't expecting any groundbreaking scholarly finds. It's just not what you'd expect for an anthology. Maybe a monograph, maybe a journal article, because those are the ones that are more highly rated by the refs. But sure enough, I did have scholarly finds. And they were completely by accident, which is the way the best discoveries are always made. And so the first one actually came through the first interview. Because, you know, to make this book as good as it's ever going to be, you need to have interviews that cover the full spectrum of Ellroy's career. My trouble is Ellroy became famous quite late. Not really until the publication of the Black Dahlia in 1987 did he become famous. And even then, that was a moderate fame. Really, his real fame, his kind of literary celebrity fame, came in the mid-90s with the start of the Underworld USA trilogy. And, he did thousands of interviews then, which were all good and fine. But I didn't want this book to start in the kind of like late 80s, mid-90s. I needed it to start at the beginning of his literary career. But I found this interview from 1984, published in Armchair Detective, which was the absolute, Bible of genre fiction magazines at the time. But it'd been out of print for a while. It'd gone out of circulation. So I reached out to Otto Penzler, who owned Armchair Detective for a while, and Otto Penzler is an absolute legend in his own right, and Ellroy fans will recognize his name as a major influence in Ellroy's career, a major help, and they were friends. And Otto says to me, this is where it gets funny. He says to me, well, I don't think anyone from Armchair Detective is still around because the woman I gave the magazine to, Judith Fowles, is missing and wanted by the IRS. And I was like, oh. So whatever you want to use, you can use free of charge as far as I'm concerned. But you'd better reach out to the interviewer who interviewed Ellroy in 84, because he might own the copyright. I have no idea. That interviewer was Dwayne Tucker, who was an actor. He was in things like Police Story or Cop Story by Joseph Wambaugh produced show. According to IMDb, he was in Fast Times at Ridgemont High, but I watched it, I couldn't find him in it. He's a very tall, kind of rangy New Yorker, gravelly voice, but very erudite and, a writer. He wrote poetry, he wrote a play. But when I reached out to him, he was living in Canada, and he'd been very good friends with Ellroy for a while. And he told me, look, I didn't conduct this interview with Ellroy. What I think happened is James wrote the interview himself, then used my name to, get himself publicity. And then I was like, yes, that all makes perfect sense. Because for his first few novels, Ellroy, Brown's Requiem, Clandestine, no one was interviewing him. I think his first genuine interview was with Illinois DJ, but that was lost to history. But so what does he do? He goes and interviews himself. A number of key writers have done it. Usually when they're already famous. Guys like Norman Mailer had done that. And it's an interesting exercise for an author to do, because one of the odd things about interviews is you never ask what you expected, which is good. But if you're asked what you expected, what you want to be asked, you can really say what you've always practiced and honed and wanted to get out there. So you can really get your message out there, which is a key point today in our social media age. So Ellroy could get his message out there, and rereading the interview, I noticed that there was a lot of, I am, a lot of swagger. I am the new kid on the block when it comes to crime fiction. I'm going to sweep everybody else away. And there were also little clues that I put in the text that, there's the deliberate misspelling of icon with a K, iconic. And Ellroy, did that. He loves those hard consonant sounds. He's always replacing C's with K's in his kind of alliterative games and those sorts of things. But I mean, I was still in touch with Ellroy and I asked him about it, and he was very coy about it. I get a message back from his PA saying James has no recollection of the interview. Like his friend Wayne Tucker, he has no recollection. And I mentioned it to Otto Penzler, and he was kind of furious with me. He's just like, oh no, I would never have done that. I would have spotted it was a fake. He got kind of indignant about it. But anyway, I wrote up my findings and, I put it in there. And I think that's what made this book, just a bit more special and a bit more important is that, I managed to get a really good scholarly find. Years later, it was confirmed by Ellroy to me. First, kind of elusively, I went to see him in Manchester, where he always stops by when he's doing a UK tour. And we chatted for a while afterwards. And just as I'm walking away, he's like, Steve, your work is iconic with a KKK. Iconic with a KKK. And I loved that. That was the way Ellroy, spoke to me. And that's the way you had to proceed. If you're a scholar working with, a living author, because they're not going to tell you things directly. And, you work with the material, the evidence that you've got. When we were doing the biography, he did just come out and say it. And he was still a bit sheepish about it, but he's got nothing to lose now. He's like the demon dog of American literature. And he even said to me, because I had another interview with Otto Penzler lined up, he's like, if you mention the Tucker interview with him, he might still deny it. He's like, people are strange and they're proud. Anyway, I did interview Penzler. He didn't deny it at this stage, but he was very sheepish about it. It's just like, okay, move on. So, all in all, the book went like a dream. First books often do. I don't know why, but I think they're softening you up, I suppose. And, the first time you get a book published, it's great. You think you're going to be famous, and you're sat by the phone waiting for Monica Bellucci to call. But then the phone rings, and it's not Monica Bellucci. It's your Auntie Mabel congratulating you and getting a book out. But, the book turned out almost exactly as I wanted it to do. There was one moment in it when the book was about 80 to 85,000 words. That was the word count that University of Mississippi Press wanted. There was one particular good interview with Ellroy from the mid-90s that ran to about 11,000 words. So I'd reached out to the interviewer, and, he's a good journalist, good writer. I'm not going to mention his name here. He'd done a lot of writing on the James Bond film series, so I knew who he was beforehand. And he said, yeah, you can use it. He asked for a nominal fee. I said, yeah, I'll take that out of my budget. But then he didn't sign the copyright waiver. And the whole thing hinged on that, copyright license. He just disappeared. He just went completely MIA. This is another thing in publishing and show business is, people can do a dodge. You can be as close as you think you can possibly be with another person, and then one day they'll just disappear. They'll cut you. So this guy disappeared for the longest time. I'm getting close to deadline. And I was just like, 11,000 words. I put so much aside for him. So what I did is I got the licensing on several smaller interviews that would have plugged the gap. And then, thank goodness, right before deadline, he suddenly reemerges. He's just like, oh, I'm so sorry, I've been ill. And I just, I don't know if it's true or not, but I'd sent him a number of reminders that he'd completely ignored. Anyway, I got the interview in. That's it. It's in. You get it the way you want it. And that, it's all to the good. You worry about the consequences later. And it sold reasonably well and still sells. I'm still getting royalty statements for it. And, again, it's not a big book by any means, but it's my book. And I'm proud of it. I'm in my own small way, it was an achievement that, I was proud of. But once the excitement wears off, and this is the real killer, and this is the message that needs to go out to all writers, you sit around and you get frustrated. I mean, you probably got other jobs and other things in your life going on, family and stuff. And you're like, oh, all of the laughs that I had, all of the anxiety that I had, all of the energy that I managed to pour out into this book, where do I direct it to? Okay, well, the simple answer is you go out and write another one. Whatever it is, poetry, novels, short stories, non-fiction, plays, you go out and you do it. I've My only regret in life is that I haven't spent more time writing. But I've published 5 books. I'm under contract for my 6th book. And, I know I will publish more. But as for Monica Bellucci, she still hasn't called. Okay, normal service will resume next week. Thanks very much for listening. I'll see you next time.